Hi, it's Alexander Russo with The Grade, and this is the Education Show. And I am delighted to be here today with the New York Times' Katie Benner to talk about her new book with Erica Green about the Landry scandal from a few years ago. Katie, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Tell us a little bit about yourself as a journalist and about the book you have just published.
Sure. So I'm a reporter at the New York Times on our investigations team. I previously covered the Justice Department under the first Trump administration, and before that, Silicon Valley, big tech companies. And then before that, I'm very old. In a previous life, I had also covered hedge funds, private equity, and Wall Street.
Lots of nefarious things to cover in all those beat
Saying that
areas.
makes me feel ancient.
That's all right. I'm sure I've got you by 10 years at least. Tell us a little bit about the book that you've just published. It's out. It seems like it's getting a great reception. What's the gist of what the book is telling us?
Yeah, so the title of the book is Miracle Children, and it's based on a 2018 story that I wrote with Erica Green, who many of these viewers will know because she's one. I mean, I think she's the country's best education reporter. I'm also biased because she's my friend, but she is so excellent. And we worked on a story together about a school called TM Landry, which at that point in time had some national renown and had been on CBS This Morning and a couple of other big shows because it was boasting 100% college acceptance rate. Most of the students were Black, and they were all getting into top tier universities and Ivy League schools. So it was a feel good story that I think the nation really embraced, in part because things were kind of dark in 2016, 17, and 18. Harken back to Trump administration one, which is
Uh,
hard to do because time kind of stopped last year. But harken back to Trump administration one, and we were already starting to grapple with things like increasing racial divides, a big anti immigration push in the country. And suddenly you have this story that no matter what your political views are, seems to appeal to everyone, especially people who believe that education is the difference between haves and have nots, power, not having power, a white collar life where you can afford a mortgage and a life where you can't. So this is a wholly positive story. We got a tip though that the Landrys themselves, who I need to say right off the top have vociferously denied any wrongdoing at all. But the Landrys themselves were not only emotionally and sometimes physically abusing the students, but that much of what was happening in terms of the college application process was falsified. So we looked into it and found um, that there were several families and students who were willing to speak openly about their experience, and we found that unfortunately this school was not delivering on its promises.
Now, just to be clear, the test scores weren't being falsified. The kids were
No.
able to take, and this isn't a varsity blues fake test taker situation. This is a situation where the essays and the narrative are falsified.
Yeah, and what's so interesting about this is that what we found that the students were learning inside of the school was basically how to take the ACT. And when I spoke with Erica about this, it really resonated with a lot of her previous reporting about how test scores had become such a flashpoint in education. You have a world where some of the most elite colleges are trying to get rid of test scores as a marker of excellence because of how inequitable school resources have become. And so there's an argument to be made that if you're from a poorer district of the country, you're not going to be able to take that test as well. And it's not quite as good a marker or indication of aptitude as we want it to be. At the same time, in the charter school movement, and because of policies like No Child Left Behind, there are schools that are being graded almost entirely on metrics like test scores, and these other kind of like hard and fast metrics that lead to things like cheating scandals and an attempt to game the system because the consequences for not hitting certain metrics are really dire. You lose funding as a school, you lose teachers, you lose resources, and suddenly you go into a death spiral of a school, their conditions worsening and worsening because of these test scores. So you have a school that is basically teaching kids how to take the ACT, and it's being drilled into them week after week, month after month, in some cases for a couple of years. So they do often come out with pretty good test scores. But it's another indicator of like, test scores are gameable. Most people don't go to this kind of extreme to game them, but they are very gameable. And the colleges see that paired with these fake false stories that traded negative racial stereotypes about Black people, the students being homeless, the students having had drug addicted parents. And this becomes suddenly a very compelling application package to readers and admissions offices in some of the nation's most elite
Right.
institutions.
I don't want to belabor the point, and don't want to give everything away, but I just want to be clear because people yesterday on social media kept asking me, did the kids flunk out of college?
Mm.
And my understanding is, I flipped ahead. Uh, my understanding is that the kids were not academically totally unprepared, that the kids did have some academic training, and in fact, some of them did quite well at elite schools. Is that fair to say? I didn't read the whole thing.
Yeah, and just like 2 points on that. The first about the school itself is you can see the evolution of the school break down into almost two portions. Early on, it's a homeschool, and students are getting into more local colleges, and they're getting into state universities. I think I think that like pretty much any institution, accredited institution of higher learning, is going to do a good job with any student who really wants to learn. So they are getting into college, and they're doing pretty well. You have one student who becomes like the top math student at her school. Things are going okay, but it's when Mike gets a student into an Ivy League school that he realizes this draws interest that is different. There's a world that loves elite education, and elite education does confer such a specific set of opportunities. And he understands that there are people who will pay good money to go to that kind of school. Like, look at Alexander. I don't know where you are. I'm sitting right now in Midtown Manhattan, and in 3 miles in any any place from where I'm sitting, there is a school that charges like nearly six figures a year, if not more. Dalton, Horace Mann, Spence. And one of the reasons people are paying up is because they believe if their kids go to these schools, it's a path to, a top 50 college, an Ivy League school. So he's not wrong in his assessment what people will pay for. And then he starts to recruit students who are already doing well in other high-ranking, excellent local high schools to come to TM Landry with this promise. And so then this like almost new kind of student starts to come in their senior year
Mm-hmm.
to graduate from TM Landry.
But are they bombing out once they get into these schools? Again, I don't want to belabor the point, but
No, I mean, so this is also what's interesting. Some of the students who are, especially from that, previous group of kids who end up at whether it's a Yale or, a school like Wesleyan, they do struggle. They really, really struggle. They're not prepared to do much other than take the ACT,
right.
which also we have to think about what that says about tests like the ACT and the SAT.
Right.
The other thing is for some of the students who come in, who are in that second wave of classes, they get to college and they pass, they graduate. They might not all graduate within 5 years. And keep in mind, I say this as somebody who struggled in college, and I'm happy to talk about that later, but like, I do not pass any judgment on people who do not graduate in 5 years. I failed out. So there's no judgment passed here. And there are lots of reasons why a student can struggle in school that have nothing to do with their academics. But I would just say that for these kids, it's a very mixed bag. And I think
Yeah.
that also, if you spoke to any college admissions officer and any college dean, they would tell you that the idea, you'd have to pour truth serum into them, that the idea that every student there is meritocratically there is false. And it doesn't really have much to do with race. It has things to do with money, the ability to make the golf team, legacy admissions. There are a lot of reasons why students get into a top tier college, and they are not all predicated on being the very, very best.
You mentioned your own academic experience, and I'm a big believer in journalists being human beings too. My story in brief is that my parents tried sending my older sisters to public schools in Chicago long, long ago. It didn't go well, and they ended up pulling them and pulling me and putting us all in private progressive, Montessori, etc., where I thrived and was very lucky to do so. What was your experience with schools and school systems as a kid or later on?
I mean, so I grew up in a really blue collar town. I went to a public school that also had a vocational school, a large vocational school attached to it, because there had once been a thriving machine tool industry, and my town had been a feeder for that employee base.
Right.
And again, like some of the pressures we see on higher ed are happening because those kinds of jobs have gone away. And so it's
Right.
like you either go to college and get a job, or you don't go to college and it's really hard to get one. There was a world where you could go to a high school like mine and then walk out the door and get a good job, usually in manufacturing, but you could still buy a house at some point. So that's the kind of school I went to. I really loved school. Like I loved school. I loved reading, especially, and I loved most of my teachers. In fact, one of the people who was a reader for the book and who's thanked is my high school English teacher, Larry Carbonetti, who is like just an incredible human being. And what
Right.
I loved about at school is the teachers really cared that we all learn and we all are involved in art or literature and we have exposure to this. And it wasn't because we were all going to go to top tier colleges. It, many people weren't going to go to college, but you still deserve to have the experience of reading a novel that blows you away. You still deserve the experience of like understanding the Reconstruction period in America, whether or not you go to college. This should be for everyone. You go to school to create for citizenship, for belonging, to like understand yourself, your country, your peers. This is and to learn, to feel that learning is wonderful. So I really liked high school, and I got into a great college. I got into Bowdoin College, and I chose it because it gave me the most money for my scholarship. It had a great scholarship program. But I really flamed out when I got there because I'd never been culturally exposed to wealthy people before. I thought that a rich person was like somebody who worked as a dentist in a, could afford a lake house. Like the idea, like I'd never heard of investment banking before. I didn't know what my classmates' parents did. I didn't understand it. I just knew it was like
Right.
the teacher parking lot had Hondas and then the student parking lot had BMWs. And it was just such a culture shock that
Mhm.
I really struggled, and then I failed out and had to leave. I came back later. I did finish, but it was there are lots of reasons that you leave school.
It's interesting. I'm so glad you had a good experience earlier on in school. I used to think that journalism needed more racial diversity, and I was involved in this long push for racial diversity on the education beat. I've since realized that maybe what we needed more of was uh, a diversity of experiences with schools. So
Mm.
many of us in journalism really like schools, and you can believe that the people who choose the education beat are the people who really love schools. It's sometimes I think creates a little bit of a blind spot among education journalists or journalists writ large, because so many of us, like yourself and myself, just really enjoyed that elementary and high school experience. We need more elementary school dropouts or middle school troublemakers in education journalism. This is my theory.
I believe that you need troublemakers in every walk of life. So, yes, I agree.
So you and Erica expose the lying on the falsification on the applications and the abuse at Landry, um, and we're all who are reading these stories are dismayed at what has happened. And if you're me, dismayed that so many news outlets had previously celebrated the Landry success story without understanding or maybe bothering to check whether the stories were accurate, whether the kids could speak Mandarin, etc. You and I talked a little bit yesterday, and I was surprised to hear, it's fine, but I was surprised to hear that you're not as critical of the media who hyped the Landry story as I was, at least in 2018. What's your take?
It's funny. Okay, so I think a couple of things. Um, it was a feel good story. And if you're a reporter pressing on this and interviewing people, and every person, let me back up. I spoke to an admissions officer who said that one of the things that horrified them about this scandal is that they had certainly heard of students falsifying applications before, and they had certainly heard of parents like paying for other people to write their kids' applications and essays.
Right.
But what they hadn't heard of was a school completely designed to scam college admissions offices, where every part of the school is designed to scam a college admissions office. That means you have in lockstep teachers and students all singing from the same choir book. So if you're a
Right.
reporter and you're interviewing people and you interview every single person at the school and they all tell you the same thing, first of all, you have you start to see a consensus view. You see these great ACT scores; those are not falsified, and then you see that the students have gotten into college, and you have college admissions officers who are eager to work with a Landry school. At what point do you have to say every single person in this universe is lying to me? It's like you're not hearing a lot of contradiction. However, there are some things that I think were unusual about the school. And this is where I think the media, and I think part of it is because a lot of the people who started covering the story on a national level were not education reporters, where things just didn't make sense. When Mike would talk about the curriculum he taught, it really does not make sense. Like, you should have seen Erica's face when he was like on the phone telling us about it. He's like, we do mastery learning, but like the kids teach one another and we use videos and adults don't really get involved. They just teach one another and then they come out geniuses. It was like that no one's ever heard of that. The idea of a 100% college acceptance rate, fine, there are not many students at this school, I guess. But also, like, how many kids, can can graduate in their junior year? Like, there are all these kind of extraordinary things happening without a lot of explanation. So I think that was one of the red flags, especially for Erica. She, like I said, she's covered education for so long. She was like, this does not make sense. This curriculum does not make sense. But if you're doing a general news story for national TV news, you're not really pressing him on the details of the curriculum. And I think that is where I thought this was a definitely a failure.
The decision is made, and I'm glad you did, to write a book about what happened. And you and Erica embarked on that effort. Both of you with deep journalism chops, Erica strong on the education side. Tell us a little bit about what it's like as a journalist to write a book as opposed to produce an investigation.
Well, one is a lot easier. One has a very short time frame. One has a team of editors and graphics people and all looking at the copy. So every time you type a word, you feel confident that lots of eyes have seen it. So there's it feels like such a team effort. Writing a book feels very, very different. It feels kind of lonely. Like, even when you're working with another person and you're like batting ideas around and like trying to work through structure, at some point you both have to break away and sit in front of your computer by yourself for like, for like a stretch of 3 weeks at a time. And that is crazy making.
Right.
And you never really understand, and you go down so many different roads with structure before one really clicks. So you're also just treading over the same ground again and again. Whereas with even a 3,000 word story, like the structure is set and it's pretty,
Right.
there's a playbook for it. So that was really, really different.
And in terms of what you learned, you obviously did a ton more reporting after the initial investigation. What did you learn that you didn't know in 2018? Obviously, you fleshed things out, but were there things that you learned that were actually quite different than you had thought or had been told?
Yeah, I mean, so I think that we learned a lot of factual things, and then the reporting really reframed how we thought about race and education in
Mm.
new ways. So on the reporting side, we needed to learn a ton more about Mike Landry. Like, it was just a very, very intense effort to understand this person who was hard, in some ways hard to get to know. But we got lucky and ended up, you know, meeting people from his further back in his past, including his ex-wife, who really helped fill in a lot of pieces about who he was.
Mm.
And we wanted to get to know the kids a lot better because this is their story. And so then we needed to understand them because we wanted them to be the human beings they are on the page, who are explaining why they did the things they did.
Right.
And then in terms of what else we learned, it was very interesting to go back and really dig into how schools have understood their role in the fight to either preserve a racial hierarchy and preserve discrimination or to end it. Because schools have done both depending on where you look in history and why schools are so important. And so like there everybody understood that learning was the difference between having power and not having power. This is why slaves were not allowed to learn, not allowed to read. Because once you read, I mean, look what happens. Frederick Douglass escapes slavery, is mostly self-educated, predominantly self-educated, and goes on to become a renowned author, thinker, scholar, philosopher, diplomat. Like he has this amazing career. So it defies what society is telling you about people who are not white. Defies what society tells you specifically about people who are black. There's so many things going on there. And so we know from the inception of the country that there is something about education that is extremely powerful, and it is not extended to black people except through multiple fights. Some of them very violent. I think the Civil War is pretty violent. The post Reconstruction period with the rise of the KKK, as the Klan is trying desperately to roll back desegregation and roll back all of the gains made after the Civil War, including that era's Civil Rights Act, including the fact that there are black people in Congress, black diplomats. Washington, D.C. has a flourishing black community of scholars, thinkers, politicians. To undo that is very, very violent. That's why you have this horror of lynching that lasts for decades. It is so violent to roll back that much. So education, the schoolhouse is where these battles are happening. And so we
Right.
really we wanted that to be our frame. So the students are not just telling the story of themselves, they are a moment in time in this longer fight that I think more people should understand.
One of the things that I'm imagining comes up as you're reporting for the book and getting to know the students and Mike Landry and his wife more clearly is the issue of as you mentioned, their treatment or their depiction. The students especially, they've been publicly humiliated
Mm,
to some extent by the revelation that part of their college acceptance was falsified. They and their families may be think it's worth the sacrifice to make sure that the Landrys don't get to keep doing what they've been doing, but they're in a very vulnerable situation. And I'm curious about how you and Erica grappled with the fact that your reporting in your book were going to resurface this awful experience that they had.
mhm. So with the reporting, we were very fortunate that it was the families that came to us to report out the story. The tip that we got, we got entirely because there was a, a wave of discontentment happening with the families at Tam Landry.
Right.
And so it was the people who wanted this story told that we worked with on the newspaper article. Even so, we knew that there could be really severe consequences for some of the students, whether or not they were in the story. I remember, going through and calling the communications officers at every college that had a Tam Landry student that we could identify, whether or not they were in the story, and explaining what the story was and explaining that there was a student on their campus who could be who could face severe internet bullying. We did not know what was going to happen. We were really, really concerned. So there was just a lot of work, I think, on the back end to try to prepare the families for what was going to come. And it was
Mhm.
all very raw for them. They had just left the school or they were still there.
Right.
The book comes out, oh my goodness, it's like 7 years later.
Right.
And the students themselves who are featured in the book have a lot of distance now from that experience, and they've been able to mull it over. So one of the reasons why the book is richer is because the students themselves are reflecting on that time,
Mhm.
and they're making, again, we're only working with people who want to be part of this. We're not forcing people, we're not like it's not an expose of these students and who was doing something wrong you've never heard of. It's more like students who were caught in this situation. And what was interesting to me is like when we worked on the story in 2018, a lot of the kids were like really, really scared about the consequences for themselves, but they were also very, very, you know, they really focused on Mike and what Mike did to them. And now you have a situation where their time has passed and they are reflecting on the same things, but they're also talking about why Mike's philosophy that white America never wants Black people to succeed and is okay to do this, why it was so resonant. They have a lot more life experience, a lot more historic experience, and they just bring, I thought, such thoughtful, insightful views. It was so that made it very, very different too. It's the difference between 17 and in your early 20s. I mean, like I think,
Yeah.
and it was great. It was just great to speak to them.
If you're willing, I'd love to hear a little bit more about that. It's easy for me to understand why the media loved the T.M. Landry spectacle before it was revealed. And it's easy for me to understand why readers of stories about the T.M. Landry miracle wanted to read them, because there's so much societal unease, guilt, etc., desire to see and think about our society as more equitable, with more social mobility than it might really have. What was the part, and I feel like I've met education grifters, if that's okay to use as a description for Landry. I feel like I've met hucksters and grifters before in education, but what did you get about the susceptibility of kids and families to this vision or these aspirations and this sort of tough love, high standards approach?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's the sale of that dream to people who had, had visceral first-hand experience with feeling discriminated against, that feeling of living in a world that does not prioritize you or your children. So that made them very open to a person who came and reflected that truth back to them.
Mm.
So there's absolutely, it's one of the reasons why T.M. Landry appealed to them. They're like, this is a couple that is telling us what we know to be true. And they're saying, we can help your kid get out of this situation. Mm-hmm. Very, very powerful. So there certainly, I think that is extremely important as to why families enrolled their students there and kept their students there, whether or not their students really loved being there. I'm sorry, what was the second part of your question?
No. That you got right to it. I can't help but think that there are or will be more T.M. Landrys now that we've got so much public funding for private school choice, so much unregulated choice. A situation that might have been particular to the South or might have been particular even to Louisiana is about to become some version of nationwide, and the lack of regulation and the deep frustrations and hopes of parents and families who want different or better than the traditional public schools. We're going to see a wave of this, is what I'm guessing.
Oh, absolutely.
And that brings me to one of my last questions, which is, what do we do? Journalistically, this is my problem, not yours, but what do we do journalistically, societally, to limit the flourishing or the thriving or the abuse of kids in schools like this? What advice do you give to other journalists or journalists who come behind us, who might be tempted by the feel-good story, but know from your book no better?
I think that for journalists, it's a matter of saying, if something looks too good to be true, it probably is. And it's okay to explore what's really happening, no matter how the facade of the story makes you feel. And keep in mind, Eric and I were both sharing those videos too when they came out of kids getting into Harvard. We were one of the millions of people in America who loved them. And we loved them for the reason that they were almost like a release valve from all of the racial tension that was happening in the country and that we everyone in the country has lived with, whether they want to, conscious or not, to
Mm-hmm.
see the success of these Black students was so attractive. And very few people, and we did not either, interrogate, why is that so attractive to us?
Mm-hmm.
Why is this so extraordinary that a Black child could get into Harvard? Doesn't that also say something fairly dark about the country, fairly negative about the country, that if a white person achieves the highest height, we're just like, yeah, that's normal. Of course, that's
Right.
what a white person does. But
Right.
when somebody who's Black does it, it's a cause for a national celebration. Like, there is something happening in that undercurrent, and that it's also okay to explore those harder ideas. And that as journalists, that is something that we have the privilege to do when we get the opportunity.
The discomfort, to lean into the discomfort.
You know, it is a hard part of the job, but it is also a huge privilege, like to be able to interrogate the world and to be paid to interrogate the world and try to understand
Mm-hmm.
it better. Very few
Mm-hmm.
people get to do that as a career. My dad worked in a factory. That was not what he got to do. Um, you know, a lot of my family members, most of my family, all of my family have not, have not gone to college. And so, they're doing, I think, extraordinary work in their lives and living great lives. All I'm saying is that to be able to dedicate your life to exploring things that make you uncomfortable, but could help
Mm-hmm.
you think differently about the world and help other people think differently about the world, it's a huge privilege.
Mm. It is, as you acknowledge, and as I can relate, it is also deeply, deeply uncomfortable, especially if you're operating from a position of relative or absolute privilege compared to the people you're writing about.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And doing it with empathy is extremely important.
I should have asked you this before we got started, but do you happen to have a copy of the book around that you could show to the camera?
So I don't, because I've given out all of my copies this
Oh,
week. I've
it's
been
still.
meeting with I have a meeting with TV producers and old contacts in the media world trying to drum up press for the book. And every time I meet with somebody, I give away like a
You,
couple of copies. And so I'm out. I'm so
no,
sorry.
don't worry about it. You need it. Obviously, you need the publicity folks to send you another box. Um, the reception has been very strong thus far, so far as I've seen. There's been the New York Times review. There are a bunch of events. Can you tell us a little bit about what happens next in terms of shows? I hope you're booked on all the shows. Tell us what's coming.
So we have an event tonight. This is Wednesday, the 14th, at the Strand in New York City on Columbus Avenue and 81st Street. Tomorrow, we're speaking at the Pratt Library in Baltimore. Friday, we will be speaking at Politics and Prose in Washington, D.C. We have an appearance coming up on CNN this evening, and then PBS NewsHour. I am
Right.
unsure about whether or not there'll be more press. And then we will be going to Louisiana, to Lafayette, which is very close to the town where the story unfolds, to do a reading there at Cavalier House Books, which we're so privileged to be able to do, because we really wanted to make sure that we had time in the community, because their questions at the book talk, I know, will be just very, very different. And I cannot wait to hear what people have to say and how they're thinking about it. Because I think, it's like, it's different to be in New York and DC and have these very almost academic conversations about the book, but
Mhm.
we wanted to be back in the community of people who are so impacted. And then
Mhm.
the last stop on the tour, I think, is the Tulane Book Festival in New Orleans in March. So we have a lot to do, because we want as many people as possible to understand the lives of these students and to read their stories.
I'm so glad that you're going back to near to the school. I wrote a book a bunch of years ago about South Central LA high school, and I didn't go back and do an event at the school, which I really should have. So it's great that you're doing that. You also were on Morning Joe, I think. So
Yeah.
the cavalcade of attention has really taken off. Thank you so much for doing this, Katie. I really appreciate it. Congratulations, and thanks for being on the show.
Thank you so much. I hope you have a great day.